Welcome to the Daily History Chronicle. Each day, we travel back to discover a pivotal moment that changed the world. These aren't just dates and facts. They're stories of courage, conflict, innovation, and consequence that still echo through our lives today. Are you ready to explore? Let's see what happened on this day in history.
Good morning and welcome to today's episode. I'm Richard Backus, publisher of University Teaching Edition, and each day I invite you to join me as we reflect on a significant moment from our shared past. Today is November 16th, and we're looking back 92 years to November 16th, 1933. On that day, President Franklin D. Roosevelt did something that would have been unthinkable to his predecessors. He formally recognized the Soviet Union and established diplomatic relations with a government that America had refused to acknowledge for 16 years. It was a stunning reversal. Since the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917, the United States had maintained that the communist government in Moscow was illegitimate, dangerous, and unworthy of diplomatic recognition. 3 successive Republican administrations under Wilson, Harding, Coolidge, and Hoover had held firm against recognition despite pressure from businesses eager to trade with Russia, and despite the fact that most other major powers had already established relations with the Soviets. But FDR, less than 9 months into his presidency, made a different calculation. Ideology, he decided, would have to yield to pragmatism. And that decision in November 1933 offers us a powerful lens for examining one of the most persistent tensions in American foreign policy. When do you talk to your adversaries? When does practical necessity override ideological opposition? And what are the costs of refusing to engage? To understand what FDR did in 1933, we need to understand why the United States had refused to recognize the Soviet Union in the first place. When the Bolsheviks seized power in November 1917, they didn't just overthrow the Russian government. They repudiated everything the old order stood for. They pulled Russia out of World War I, leaving the Allies in the lurch. They nationalized foreign property without compensation, including substantial American investments. They refused to honor the debts of the former Russian government, and they actively promoted world revolution, creating the Communist International to spread their ideology globally. To American leaders in 1917, this wasn't just a government with different policies. It was a revolutionary movement dedicated to overthrowing capitalism and democracy worldwide. President Woodrow Wilson sent American troops to Russia during the Civil War that followed the revolution, ostensibly to protect Allied supplies, but in reality hoping to undermine the Bolshevik government. When the Bolsheviks won the Civil War and consolidated power, the United States simply refused to recognize their legitimacy. No diplomatic relations, no ambassador, no formal channels of communication. It was as if, in the eyes of American foreign policy, the Soviet Union simply didn't exist. This position had costs. American businesses lost access to what could have been a significant market. Intelligence gathering became more difficult. When crises arose, there were no diplomatic channels to manage them. But 3 administrations believed those costs were worth paying to maintain ideological purity and to avoid legitimizing a regime they viewed as fundamentally hostile to American values. Then came 1933, and the world looked very different. The Great Depression was devastating the American economy. By the time FDR took office in March 1933, unemployment stood at 25%. Banks were failing. Farms were foreclosed. The American economy desperately needed new markets for its goods. The Soviet Union, meanwhile, was embarking on massive industrialization under Stalin's 5-year plans. They needed machinery, technology, and expertise that American companies could provide. Here was a potential market of 160 million people undertaking the largest industrial development in history. To American businesses struggling through the Depression, that looked like an opportunity too good to pass up. But the calculation wasn't just economic. The international situation was growing dangerous in ways that made the Soviet Union look less like an ideological threat and more like a potential strategic partner. In Europe, Adolf Hitler had come to power in Germany in January 1933. Within months, he had begun dismantling German democracy and rearming in violation of the Versailles Treaty. France and Britain were alarmed but uncertain how to respond. The Soviet Union, sharing a long border with Germany, was even more concerned. In Asia, Japan had invaded Manchuria in 1931 and showed every sign of further expansion. Japan's military was growing more aggressive, more nationalistic, and more hostile to Western interests in the Pacific. The Soviet Union, with its long Pacific coast and its eastern territories bordering Japanese-controlled territory, saw Japan as a direct threat. Suddenly, the Soviet Union didn't look like America's only problem. It looked like a country facing the same adversaries America might soon face. Franklin Roosevelt had been thinking about Soviet recognition since before his inauguration. He had criticized the non-recognition policy during his campaign, arguing that you couldn't solve problems with a country you refused to talk to. FDR's approach was characteristic of his political style: pragmatic, flexible, willing to experiment. He didn't love communism. He had no illusions about Stalin's brutality. But he also didn't believe that refusing to recognize reality served American interests. In October 1933, Roosevelt invited Soviet Foreign Minister Maxim Litvinov to Washington for negotiations. The talks were surprisingly warm. Litvinov was an old Bolshevik, but also a sophisticated diplomat who understood Western concerns. He and Roosevelt developed a working relationship, even a certain personal rapport. The negotiations centered on American demands. The Soviets must pledge not to interfere in American internal affairs or promote communist propaganda in the United States. They must guarantee religious freedom for Americans in the Soviet Union. They must commit to negotiating the debts of the former Russian government. Litvinov agreed to everything, at least on paper. He signed agreements addressing American concerns. He made promises about debt negotiations. He gave assurances about religious freedom and non-interference. On November 16, 1933, the United States officially recognized the Soviet Union. Diplomatic relations were established. Ambassadors would be exchanged. After 16 years, the silence was broken. Did recognition achieve what FDR hoped? The answer is complicated. Trade with the Soviet Union did increase, though not as dramatically as American businesses had hoped. The Soviets needed Western technology, but they also lacked hard currency and were increasingly focused on economic autarky. The Depression-era boost to the American economy was modest at best. On the political side, the results were even more mixed. The Soviets largely ignored their promises about debt repayment. Religious freedom for Americans in the USSR remained restricted. And as for non-interference in American affairs, the Soviet Union continued to support the American Communist Party and engage in espionage activities. What recognition did provide was channels of communication. When tensions arose, there were diplomats who could talk to each other. When war broke out in Europe in 1939, and especially after Germany invaded the Soviet Union in 1941, those diplomatic channels would prove crucial. The alliance between the United States and Soviet Union that would help defeat Nazi Germany was built on the foundation of recognition, established in 1933. The debate FDR settled in 1933 has never really ended. It recurs in different forms with different adversaries in every generation of American foreign policy. Do you talk to governments you find ideologically abhorrent? Do you establish relations with regimes that violate human rights, that threaten their neighbors, that oppose everything you stand for? Some argue that diplomatic recognition is simply acknowledging reality. Countries exist, whether you recognize them or not. Refusing to talk to them doesn't change their behavior. It just eliminates your ability to influence that behavior. It removes channels for managing crises and prevents you from pursuing your interests. Recognition, in this view, isn't approval, it's pragmatism. Others argue that recognition grants legitimacy. It normalizes relationships with oppressive regimes. It can be seen as tacit approval of their actions. And the history of trying to moderate adversaries' behavior through engagement is mixed at best. Sometimes engagement leads to change. Sometimes it just gives authoritarian regimes international acceptance while they continue the same policies. We've had this debate about China, about Cuba, about Vietnam, about Iran, about North Korea. We're having it today about various governments around the world. President Obama's decision to normalize relations with Cuba in 2014 echoed FDR's Soviet recognition in many ways, overcoming decades of non-recognition, arguing that engagement serves American interests better than isolation, facing criticism that he was legitimizing an oppressive regime. President Trump reversed some of those changes. President Biden partially restored them. The debate continues. We face similar questions about engaging with adversaries today. When should we talk to the Taliban? Should we negotiate with Iran? How do we manage relationships with Saudi Arabia given concerns about human rights? What about Venezuela or other governments that clash with American values? There's no simple answer. Each case is different. But the underlying tension FDR navigated in 1933 remains. How do you balance principles and pragmatism? When do ideological commitments serve your interests, and when do they constrain you from pursuing those interests effectively? FDR's decision in 1933 offers some guideposts for thinking about these questions. First, non-recognition is a tool, not a principle. Its value depends on whether it advances your goals. If refusing to recognize a government makes that government more likely to change its behavior or collapse, it might be worth the costs. But if non-recognition simply removes your ability to influence events without changing the reality on the ground, you're paying the costs of isolation without gaining the benefits of pressure. Second, you don't have to like a government to talk to it. Diplomatic relations aren't a gold star for good behavior. They're a means of managing relationships, communicating interests, and preventing misunderstandings that can lead to conflict. FDR didn't recognize the Soviet Union because he approved of Stalin. He recognized it because he believed the United States needed channels to pursue its interests. Third, the perfect can be the enemy of the good. Waiting for adversaries to meet all your conditions before you'll talk to them is a recipe for permanent standoff. FDR got less than he wanted from the Soviets. They didn't honor their debt commitments or fully protect religious freedom. But he got something: communication channels that would matter when the world went to war. Finally, pragmatism has its own risks. Engaging with adversaries can indeed normalize behavior you oppose. It can be seen as weakness or appeasement. FDR's critics in 1933 argued he was legitimizing a murderous regime for ephemeral economic gains. Some of those criticisms were valid. Recognizing the Soviet Union didn't moderate Stalin's behavior. It didn't lead to democracy. It didn't prevent the purges or the gulags, but it did give the United States diplomatic tools it would need in the coming crisis. When Germany launched World War II, when the Soviet Union became a crucial ally against Hitler, the relationship established in 1933 mattered. On this November 16th, 92 years after FDR extended recognition to the Soviet Union, these questions feel remarkably current. We live in a world where our adversaries aren't going away. We face challenges from governments that don't share our values, that threaten international order, that oppress their own people. The question isn't whether these governments are good or bad. That's usually clear. The question is how best to advance our interests and our values in a world where these governments exist and have power. Sometimes that means refusing recognition or engagement to impose costs and signal disapproval. Sometimes it means pragmatic engagement to manage tensions and pursue concrete goals. Most often, it means something in between, maintaining channels of communication while also imposing costs for behavior we oppose. The lesson of 1933 isn't that engagement always works or that pragmatism always trumps principle. It's that foreign policy requires making hard choices where no option is perfect. FDR's Soviet recognition didn't solve all problems. It created some new ones, but it gave the United States options and tools that mattered when they were needed most. That's the nature of statesmanship, making imperfect choices in an imperfect world, trying to advance your interests and your values, knowing that you'll satisfy no one completely, including yourself. Thank you for joining me today on the Daily History Chronicle. As philosopher George Santayana reminds us, those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. Until tomorrow, may your day be enriched by the lessons of history.